Hello, everyone, and welcome to this ad hoc episode of the Particular Baptist Podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Vincent. You can find us on other podcasts at reformpodcast.com. Also, check out our blog at theparticularbaptist.net. Now, this is not a normal episode. This is kind of like double tapping, I guess, because we just did a live episode earlier today. But I wanted to respond to a podcast episode that came out from Covenant Baptist Theological Seminary on religious liberty with Baptists. And, this kind of, as you can probably imagine, for those of you who've been with us a while and seen what we've talked about on this topic, it's frustrating, it's annoying to see this stuff keep coming up because of the availability of historical material that just refutes the things that are talked about in here. Unfortunately, us Baptists are not known for our historical prowess, and I think that this video from CBTS demonstrates that we deserve that stigma. Unfortunately, it doesn't have to be that way, but it's where we go. We're not very good at church history. Church history is not historically an important topic for Baptists, and we love to rely on secondary sources for this particular topic instead of diving into the meat of the primary source material that is readily available to anybody, literally, that you can go and Google and find. You don't need some special EEOB access or some access to a dark, dingy, moldy, musty Irish library in the UK. No, this is stuff that, us laymen can figure out. But, with the availability of this stuff, unfortunately, the bad historical analyses keep being pushed. And, I do know that the recovery of this topic of a proper understanding of particular Baptist political theology, the consensus view of it anyways, is definitely more recent, and I'm thankful. We've been, I think, at the Particular Baptist, I think we've been one of the leading orgs to push that out into the forefront. I know there are others, like founders, who are trying to recover a general understanding, maybe not focusing on the Baptist side as much, but kind of the general principles of political theology that are found in the Reformed tradition, which I think you can say are found in the consensus understanding of the Particular Baptist tradition as well. But it there is there's just this unfortunate reality that people are peddling bad history, and that we've been trying to stamp that out. We've put out multiple historical analyses uh, on particular Baptist political theology. And it's not like, we're off in a corner somewhere and no one's ever heard of us. I mean, some of our work has been shared by Stephen Wolfe and James Baird, that was published by Founders, and been widely distributed. So our stuff is out there, and, these historical sources have been made available in any even greater way, I think, because of that. So there's just no excuse anymore for these historical mistakes, and I think it's just frustrating to see that. And I don't know if it's a willing ignorance, if it's, I want to be as gracious, and um, I want to be gracious to my brothers who disagree on this topic. I don't know if it's a willing ignorance, or I just don't want to leave my views. I've held to this for 30 years. I don't want to change my mind. I don't know, right? Or maybe it is a real ignorance, but I just don't think that there is any reason to be ignorant anymore. I just don't think that's an excuse, because the stuff is so readily available now that we need to have a better understanding of these things. And another problem I think that comes from this, among Baptists especially, Presbyterians got their own problems. You see what's happening with the PCA with Stephen Wolfe and Kevin DeYoung and others who are debating the Christian nationalism thing in their own circles. This isn't about that. I'm focusing on Baptists today. This, I think, Baptists have historically been very strong and vocal about absolute religious liberty, and I think that's tied to primarily to the fact that Baptists have grown quite a bit in the United States, and the United States is founded upon that principle. And so I think there is this desire to tie an American understanding of political theology or politics in general with Christianity, and trying to morph that in so you can somehow say, yes, I can hold to this politic that is in the country I live in, while also holding to this Christianity, right? To this religious point of view that I want to somehow try to make work. I don't want to live inconsistently. That's probably where this is coming from. But I think having a bad understanding of Baptist political theology, particular Baptist political theology, only hinders the proper development and discussion among Baptists to having a proper understanding of biblical and historical understandings of political theology in our circles. I think it only hinders it because we're busy debating these things, and it's good to debate them, but it seems like this from at an institutional level. This isn't like some guy in his basement online that's just floating around out there, and it's like, okay, whatever. No, this is at the institutional level, right? A major Reformed Baptist seminary is saying, pushing back against these types of things, right? And when those things come up, I think it only causes confusion, because then people go, wait a minute, that sounds right. You guys over here, who are for a particular Baptist proper understanding of the consensus view, you guys aren't bringing in the whole picture. Maybe, it causes confusion. It causes confusion, and I think it prevents the discussion from moving forward properly, because they're over here saying, well, this is actually what they believe, and then we're over here saying this is what they actually believe, and then people are doing this, right? Now, I think there is a sense where it does create a hindrance in the discussion, and I think that we got to get past. We need to come to a proper understanding of these things and have proper discussion. So I want to go through at least some of this. It's 12 minutes long, so we might be able to get through all of it. But I want to take a look at this here and discuss it further. Trying to pull up my screen share went away. Apologies for that. Is it going to come back? Oh boy. There it is. Always something technical you got to mess with. There we go. All right. So we'll take a look at this here.
You are listening to Particular Pilgrims, stories from Reformed Baptist history with commentary. I'm your host, Ron Miller, pastor of Covenant Baptist Church of Clarksville, Tennessee, and a longtime student and collector of Particular Baptist history. This is brought to you by Covenant Baptist Theological Seminary. Because of the interest in this series on religious liberty, I've decided to add another episode. This will give you a very condensed history of the concept of freedom of conscience in Protestant, Reformed, Dissenting, and Baptist thought. I will show.
Now, that's an important thing that he brings up. He's saying this is very condensed, but the way he's presenting it makes it seem like, well, this is the view that Baptists had about this topic. And as we're going to see, it's not. And we've demonstrated this elsewhere. This isn't to go through, the entire historical narrative that we've presented already. But I want to focus on certain points that he brings up. But that is a very important point that he brings up, he's making it seem like that this represents, it's a condensed view of what the view of Baptists were about this topic. So that is, he's setting the precedent for what's to come.
Show some of the interactions between the various major proponents of soul liberty and the central role that Baptists played. I'll include suggested reading for those of you who would like to explore this topic further. In the last episode, I began by saying that liberty of conscience was a significant doctrine of the Reformation. Indeed, the name Protestant came about because at the Second Diet of Speyer, German Lutheran princes protested against the emperor's proposed limitations on their practice of religion. The minority Lutherans famously said, quote, "In matters of conscience, the majority has no power." In their response, they argued that each man gives an account to God for himself. The Bible was to be interpreted by comparing Scripture with Scripture, not on the authority of the church. And it had to meet the test of what they called right conscience. So the right of private judgment, or liberty of conscience, was at the heart of early Protestant thought. It was a newly emerging notion for them and very inconsistently practiced, especially toward the Anabaptists. Their basic idea of it came from Martin Luther. At the Diet of Worms, he had famously declared that he would not accept the Pope's authority over the Scriptures. His conscience was captive to the Word of God. He would not recount his opinions because to go against conscience was neither right nor safe. In his early writings on church and state, Luther argued for the priesthood of believers. Each man had a right and duty to interpret the Bible himself. His two kingdoms theology taught that the laws of civil government applied only to earthly life and property, but the soul is ruled by God alone. When the government overreaches this, it harms souls and steals from God's government.
Now, this is interesting, and I thought it was strange that he brought up Luther, because, okay, Luther may have confessed that, he may have said that, fine. But if we know anything about Luther, he was all for getting these regional authorities, his regional civil authorities on his side. I mean, Frederick the Wise protected Luther, put him up in his castle so he wasn't to be killed. Luther was certainly not against using civil authority to help push his cause. He was very much in favor of that. And when we're talking about conscience, it is also important to understand that I think, at least among Baptists, the concept of liberty of conscience was not some sort of license for everybody to do whatever they wanted, but it was license for professing Protestants to be able to worship God how they felt they needed to. And of course, there were questions on other things, like, with Jews and Muslims to some extent at the or at the civil level, when you're talking about whether they should be punished for blasphemy or not. There was some debate because William Kiffin was involved in Parliament in the 1650s and had to deal with things like that. But this idea of conscience was, God only rules the conscience because God can only see it, right? Man can't regulate something they can't see. And so it should be free for us to worship God how he pleases. So basically, what we believe privately is none of the government's business as it relates to Protestant Christian belief. That was basically your consensus understanding with Particular Baptists. One thing, and there may have been some nuances, in terms of how that's applied, but that was the general principle. This idea of absolute religious liberty is ridiculous, and I don't think that Luther, again, would have been against some sort of civil authority promoting Lutheranism to some extent. I think he would have welcomed it, given the fact that you're excommunicated because you disagree with the Roman Catholic Church, which affects your livelihood, which could get you killed. So having some political powers on your side is, all for you. And I think that Luther certainly would have not been against that, despite the fact that he did not want civil overreach in the church. So you do start to see seeds of having a proper understanding of ecclesiology, where the church needs to do what it's supposed to do and the state needs to do what it's supposed to do. But Luther certainly wasn't against some sort of promotion of his views by the state, at the very least to protect his own skin. So that, I think that's something to keep in mind as well.
Luther's two most important writings on these subjects are Address to the Christian Nobility of the German Nation and Secular Authority, to What Extent It Should Be Obeyed. Many evangelical Anabaptists held an almost identical position to Luther regarding church and state, but implemented it more consistently, or at least they wished to, before they were martyred or harassed out of Germany and into the Netherlands. Their doctrine, along with the popularity of Luther's writings in that nation, had a lasting impact in its practice of religious toleration. Other reformers taught in a similar vein, but in their practice relied heavily on the local magistrates to enforce their efforts at church reform. Hence, they are categorized as magisterial reformers. In their regions, the civil rulers could punish doctrinal and practical church errors. The most famous, of course, was the execution of Michael Servetus at the hands of the Genevan government for denying the doctrines of the Trinity and infant baptism. This action was defended by John Calvin, but a colleague of Calvin's, Sebastian Castellio, argued against the role of the magistrate in spiritual matters and for toleration in a book entitled Concerning Heretics. This was only translated into English a generation ago. His dependence on Luther is clear. He detested the cruelty of the persecution of the Anabaptists, and he made the connection between personal Bible interpretation and religious freedom. Although Castellio later worked from Basel, his influence was greatest in Holland. It was there that the first General Baptists came into contact with the lives and writings of these men.
So here we go. The General Baptists are the foundation for Particular Baptist political theology. This is a common argument historically that's used among kind of the, the Reformed Baptists, historical writers who talk about this. This is basically what Dr. Nettles will say too. He'll point, I think it's to Thomas Hewell's General Baptists as kind of pushing what was representative, allegedly, of Particular Baptist political theology, which I have always found to be ridiculous. That why are we using a group that were really enemies of Particular Baptists to determine, and they disagreed with them on fundamental issues. Okay, it wasn't just like, you have blue pews and we have red pews. This was the nature of God as it relates to salvation. Basically, General Baptists were Arminians and Particular Baptists were not. And you had the atonement was general to all men, while Particular Baptists held to a particular atonement. So, there were fundamental differences between them. So to try and say that, we need to base Particular Baptist political theology off of a group understanding of political theology that was fundamentally different than Particular Baptists is a non-starter. And of course, we have plenty of writings from confessional Particular Baptists that address this very issue, but it's never addressed directly among these guys in a way that is meaningful. It's either not addressed at all, or if it's addressed, like, yeah, well, they'll come up with something to say, well, that it's not really relevant to the discussion. And so general Baptist theology kind of becomes the standard. The Anabaptist political theology becomes the standard for what particular Baptists were believed about the topic. So again, you're starting to see the same kind of argumentation come out.
As noted in an earlier episode, the Dutch Anabaptist Peter Jans Twisk's work of 1609 called Religion's Freedom was known and used by them. Smith, Busher, and Merton were all influenced by these streams of thought from Luther, Castellio, and the various Anabaptists. And from them, the Protestant ideas made their way into England, where it could be shown that the Baptists influenced the thought of dissenting Protestants, such as Roger Williams, John Milton, William Penn, and John Locke. And these were the men who had the greatest impact on the American national views of soul liberty and the separation of church and state.
Now, it's funny that he brings up, and after I heard him talk about Penn, it was like, are we is this serious? Is this a serious historical argument for Baptist, particular Baptist political theology? Because if you actually study William Penn as it relates to particular Baptists, he was no stranger to particular Baptists. In fact, William Kiffin, who was the leading English particular Baptist, arguably in most of the 17th century, wrote specifically against him. He wrote a work, or at least was part of a work, called The Quakers' Appeal Answered, or a full relation of a meeting held in Barbican the 28th of August last past, wherein the allegations of William Penn, and they have these long titles, but it's a direct response to the Quakers in relation to Penn. Penn and Kiffin did not get along, and they were very much at odds theologically. Wow, what do you know? Quakers were not exactly seen as orthodox Christians. So this idea that they would have taken some sort of religious political understanding from the Quakers and imported that into their understanding is preposterous, given what Kiffin et al. Had talked about in relation to this. You have the 1659 and 1660 declarations. You have writing a work that was a paper that was put together from the 1689 General Assembly, where multiple, including Kiffin, Keach, Knollys, three who were signers of the 1689, putting their names on it, talking about the suppression of Catholics and praising the king for that, and wanting the Protestant religion to be promoted in the land by the government, things like that. But Kiffin is important because of his role in particular Baptist, his particular Baptist life. But another example with Kiffin in particular, he didn't like, and this is in relation to the Quakers at a political level, and as it relates to religious freedom. There's a work, I got it right here. This is William Kiffin and His World, Part 3. This is by Larry J. Kreitzer. I have parts 1 and 3. I've been slowly collecting different parts over the years. I probably should get the whole series. Forward by Michael A.G. Hyken, who's a well-known Baptist historian. Don't know if he would take Kiffin's views on these things, but he wrote the forward to this. But in here, Kreitzer talks about how there was an incident with a Quaker. These Quakers, man, they're troublemakers. Why would we say that they agree? The Baptists agreed with their political theology when they were constantly spoke against them, saw them as civil troublemakers, and that they should be punished for causing some of these problems. But with Kiffin in general, remember I mentioned Kiffin was part of Parliament. He was an MP in the 1650s. And there was a very public incident where there was a Quaker that came around. His name was James Naylor. He went around he did this reenactment of Jesus. He pretended to be Jesus, and he was reenacting Christ coming into Jerusalem as a king, right? The scene in Scripture where Christ is coming into Jerusalem as a king. And this caused public outcry and civil unrest. Parliament got involved, and he was prosecuted by the civil authorities for blasphemy. And there was debate as to whether he should be put to death for this blasphemy, right? He he was considered for the death penalty. And Kiffin spoke against that. He said that he should not be put to death, but he still should be given a lesser punishment, that the government should do that. And I want to read a little bit here from this work. And Kreitzer is just simply quoting Keach. He's not interpolating. He's not saying this is what he said. This is actual. These are actual works, or from the speech that Kiffin gave in Parliament. Kiffin, it's titled "Kiffin's Opposition to the Death Penalty Being Inflicted Upon James Naylor." 13 December 1656. Thomas Burton's Diary of Parliament, 1656 through 1659, Volume 1. BLL ad MS 15,859, Filios 58, Verso 59, Recto. So if you want to go and try and look it up. But I'm going to read from certain parts of it here. But Mr. Kiffin, I am very much satisfied with the whole matter, that this wicked, vile wretch is guilty of whatever you have voted him to be, a horrid blasphemer. But I am not convinced by anything I have heard yet. I think this is saying that he ought to be punished by death. We ought all to be zealous for God, but our zeal must be gone by rule. And then toward the end, and he goes on to defend why. But then at the end, he says, I dare not be of YT opinion that XT forgave him, YT sin, for this excludes his full satisfaction, etc. I desire ye question may be put for ye smaller punishment. So he advocated for a smaller punishment. He didn't say, well, that's his religious view. He should just be able to do whatever he wants. That's his conscience. That's his religious understanding. No, he believed that should be punished. He just didn't think it should be punished by death. He thought that was a bit much. But he still thought, yeah, this guy who's causing civil unrest with his public blasphemy should not be tolerated. So again, this idea that the Quakers somehow brought in, this watershed moment about what would come to particular Baptist theology downstream is ridiculous on its face historically. Kiffin would have, been like, what are you talking about? And Kiffin being the leader, the most important English particular Baptist in that movement. You see him time and time again with his wealth. He was a merchant, a wealthy merchant. He was so wealthy that a king, I believe it was Charles II, came to him asking for a loan, and he gave it to him. He was no small name in particular Baptist circles or in civil life in general. So this notion that Quakerism would have somehow, slipped in through the cracks or whatever, or been what defined particular Baptist political theology is just historically ridiculous.
We've already extensively given William's history and works. He influenced particular Baptists Samuel Richardson and John Vernon. He was a friend of John Milton, and they mutually influenced and helped each other in several ways. Williams certainly introduced Baptist thought about soul liberty to him. Milton's most important works for our purposes are Areopagitica, his defense of freedom of speech and the press, and A Treatise of Civil Power in Ecclesiastical Causes, about civil power in religion. The major influences in Milton's increasing movement toward religious liberty are the English Baptists, especially Merton and Williams. He actually follows Merton's outline for his arguments, and these are all theological. Milton fights as a Protestant dissenter, drawing ammunition from other Protestant dissenters, mainly the Baptists. John Locke also spent time as an English exile in Holland, and saw firsthand what religious toleration could be like. Out of his experience and study, he wrote the famous Letter on Toleration, which has been summed up as the most influential statement of advanced religious.
Interestingly enough, William Kiffin and John Locke were business partners. It's another thing that Kreitzer brings out, I think, in part one. But again, clearly from what Kiffin thought in 1660s or 1650s, and what you see in his signing of the work from the 1689 General Assembly, the 1659 and 1660 declarations, there's just this consistent drumbeat against that mindset that you see from Locke, from Smith, from the Anabaptists, right? So, even though Kiffin was a business partner with John Locke, he certainly didn't adopt his dissenting theological views.
Toleration in the English-speaking world at this time. But his ideas were not original to him. They developed from contact with men such as John Owen, Sir Henry Vane the Younger, a close friend of Roger Williams, and another Protestant dissenter, William Penn, the Quaker founder of the colony of Pennsylvania. Penn wrote his work, The Great Case of Liberty of Conscience, in 1670. Both Penn and Locke wrote theologically and philosophically. Both were influenced by Roger Williams. Both believed that the ideas of Scripture fit with natural law. Now, Penn did more than write, of course. Like Williams, he put his views into practice by establishing Pennsylvania. And since Philadelphia became the leading colonial city in the early 1700s, its success proved that freedom of religion could not only work, but be a model for other civil societies. For Penn, the separation of church and state did not mean separating morality from government. It didn't for any of these men. And when we search for the sources of Locke and Penn's thought on soul liberty, we find again Helwys, Smith, Merton, and Roger Williams, the Baptists. It was Penn and Locke and Williams who were to influence Isaac Backus, the Particular Baptist pastor in the colony of Massachusetts.
Now, notice that we've jumped timelines significantly. Now we're in the colonies in America, pre-Revolutionary War. There's been no discussion here on what I've touched upon, like Kiffin's understandings, the 1659, 1660 declarations, which were consensus documents. It didn't mean it represented everyone, but it represented most of them. And what those entailed and how this ties into these guys like a Roger Williams, who, interestingly enough, was a Particular Baptist for 5 minutes before jumping ship and finding himself, not among the Particular Baptists. But, we do have consensus documents. We do have consensus views. Again, we've talked about this. I'm not going to rehash that here in detail. You can go look on our theparticularbaptist.net. We did an article about Particular Baptists being against religious liberty. We've done two episodes, at least lengthy episodes, discussing this. So I'm not going to rehash that here. You can go and listen to those things. But the point is, those types of things, those important historical realities about Particular Baptists are left out. We're jumping timelines here, like decades, maybe. Okay. So the important information is left out. He's mentioning Isaac Roger Williams, who was a Particular Baptist for 5 minutes. He'll go on to mention Samuel Richardson. While he was a Particular Baptist, and I believe he was influential in the first London Baptist Confession of Faith, he ended up denying the faith later. He abandoned orthodoxy, in particular the doctrine of hell, biblical doctrine of hell, and was no longer considered a Particular Baptist. And when we're talking like this, it's interesting. They're taking these outliers and they're taking the guys who were temporary Particular Baptists, not the guys who persevered and represented the view as a whole, but we're taking the guys that were temporary Particular Baptists who abandoned orthodoxy and went their own way. And it isn't that interesting that those who are pushing for this stuff on absolute religious liberty historically have bad fundamental theology, right? Smith was an Anabaptist, so his theology isn't orthodox to begin with. And Particular Baptists spent a lot of time distancing themselves from them because they were lumped in with these guys. And they're like, no, we're not these people. We're not these people. And the Second London Baptist Confession of Faith deals with that to some extent. They publicly distance themselves from these guys. But why are we using guys who claim to be Particular Baptists for 5 minutes? Why are we claiming that these guys are our people when it comes to representing the consensus view on Particular Baptist political theology? Okay, that would be like making Thomas Collier, who was a prominent Particular Baptist, who was well known in his circles, but abandoned the faith eventually. He taught heretical views and he was pushed out, and he was publicly distanced from by Particular Baptists in the 1670s. Okay, but this would be like saying that we should take Thomas Collier as a representative of Particular Baptist theology in general, despite the fact that he denied the faith, right? We wouldn't do that. So why are we taking these guys who abandoned Particular Baptist theology and saying that their political theology is representative of what the Orthodox Particular Baptists believe, let alone the Anabaptist General Baptists? Forget about them. They shouldn't be considered. But why are we even taking these guys who left the faith to begin with and making their view representative of everyone else who remained in the faith? That's ridiculous. That's ridiculous from a historical perspective, right? Why would we not listen to the ones who remained Orthodox and actually wrote on this? They publicly wrote on this, okay? So, again, with the debate on religious liberty, why are we taking the views of those so-called PBs and General Baptists, all of whom are considered outliers in the Particular Baptist movement, or just not even part of the Particular Baptist movement at all, when we have consensus information on this topic? Again, it's like another analogy. It's like saying I'm going to go to the Mennonites to understand what Reformed Baptists think about ecclesiology. That's what they're doing here. Mennonites are Anabaptists, right? Oh, we're going to go to the Anabaptists, who are fundamentally in opposition to the Particular Baptists, and we're going to take their political theology and impose that upon the Particular Baptists when they said things that were contrary to that in a consensus way. Okay, you might as well just go and take other things they said and impose that upon them, right? But you wouldn't do that because they've outlined what they believe. Well, they have here too. You just have to go and read it. So again, there's just this weird historical, again, when I remember reading Dr. Nettles and just kind of being blown away, like, why are we using General Baptists? Like, at least go for a Particular Baptist who remained one and say, well, this is the view. But it seemed there's this association. Those who abandon the faith have these weird political views. I wonder why. Maybe because they want their political views to be tolerated too, or their theological views to be tolerated too. Seems like they go hand in hand to me, advocate for conscience so I can believe what I want. That seems to be the case here. But we move on.
Who was so pivotal to the cause of freedom of religion in the new United States. Backus rejected Locke's unbiblical views of the nature of man, but still retained much of his language and the theological arguments he agreed with. Backus's important works on religious liberty are entitled A Seasonable Plea for Liberty of Conscience and Appeal to the Public for Religious Liberty. A study of his life is critical if one is to understand religious liberty in the United States. This all-too-short survey shows a few things. First, the roots of the Baptist doctrines of soul liberty and separation of church and state are found in the Protestant Reformation and their doctrine of Scripture. Second, these doctrines were selectively believed, often opposed, and minimally implemented. Third, it was not until these ideas were joined to others, such as
I wonder why they were minimally implemented. Maybe because the 17th century Particular Baptists, generally speaking, didn't believe in that, so they just didn't go along with those things. Again, you got to have you got to expand your historical scope here beyond the General Baptists and the Quakers, and in the the aberrant particular Baptists who abandon particular Baptist theology.
a believer's church, that they were purified, embraced, and practiced by the dissenting Protestants called Baptists. Fourth, the early General and Particular Baptists made the central scriptural arguments that the major English dissenters depended on as they made their cases for freedom of religion. The Baptists weren't followers in this area. They were the leaders and sources of the English arguments for liberty of conscience. Let me close with two more book recommendations and a related bit of advice.
If you want to look at early English Particular Baptists, Blackwood is helpful here. And I know, people make all kinds of brouhaha about Christopher Blackwood. But he remained faithful in his core understandings. He wavered on the light of nations early on in the 1640s, but then, because he signed the 1660 Declaration later, he came back around. And so if you want early English Particular Baptist theology, political theology is definitely more in line with what you find consistently, later on in English Particular Baptist consensus views on the subject.
For reliable background reading on this subject, I suggest L. John Van Til's Liberty of Conscience, The History of a Puritan Idea. Though a bit narrow, and at times dated, and at times ignorant of the Baptist contribution, the book is a solid place to start for the English context out of which grew the Baptist idea of soul liberty. A broader book is Nicholas P. Miller's The Religious Roots of the First Amendment, Dissenting Protestants and the Separation of Church and State. This superb work from Oxford University Press rightly balances the Baptist contribution while recognizing the many other cultural and civic causes that contributed to America's freedom of religion. My advice out of all of this is to be careful what you read, mostly online.
I wish the brother here took his own advice. Don't read General Baptists to understand Particular Baptist theology. Read the Particular Baptists. Read the Particular Baptists. This stuff is readily available online. Like, you can go and look. You don't need a special license or access or be a professor at a seminary. You can just Google it. What did William Kiffin believe on this? And you do your homework, you do your sleuthing and searching. We've also documented on our blog multiple sources, primary sources on this subject from Particular Baptist writers that you can go and look at yourself. So yes, please be careful what you read, but make sure you're actually reading, the proper sources to have a well-rounded understanding of these things. This, unfortunately, is not giving you that. It is a short survey, but if you're going to hit a survey, you still need to hit the key points. You don't skip over key points for the sake of condensing it, and certainly not to fit your understanding of these things theologically. Now, I'm not imputing necessarily that Brother Miller here is trying to be. I think he's genuine, and I think that's part of the problem. Is there's a genuine standing for the wrong thing, and in light of all the information that we have, an unwillingness to change your mind. I think that is probably where this is kind of going. I'm sure Brother Miller is a good brother. It sounds like he's a pastor in Tennessee. probably been pastoring for many years, and I'm sure he's a godly man. But historically, he's wrong in this area. And I think that people need to realize that we have to be better in Baptist circle. We have to be better at a history. And we have the information now. I think that's what's frustrating is it's not that people don't have the information. It's just they're not willing to do the homework when they have the information so readily available. There's just I don't think there's any excuse for this anymore. But take his advice. Be careful what you read, right?
I have found that even sources claiming to represent Reformed Baptist views are often very selective in their sources. For example, if a work lays claim to a Baptistic historical view, but doesn't include Roger Williams or Isaac Backus in any meaningful way, it really shouldn't be taken seriously.
Wow. I had listened to most of this, but I did not hear that. If a source does not include Roger Williams, it should not be taken seriously. Again, Roger Williams was a Particular Baptist for 5 minutes. He abandoned Particular Baptist theology. Why in the world are we making him him and others that were like him the litmus test for Baptist political theology? Again, we have consensus information from guys who signed the Second London Baptist Confession of Faith that Brother Ron here holds to. But no, if it doesn't include Roger Williams, just throw it out. See, this is the problem. He's the one being selective in his sources here, not us. Not us, no. We're being selective based on what the historical record shows from the guys who wrote our confession or were closely affiliated with it, not the guys who abandoned the theological framework that we claim to hold to, that Brother Ron claims to hold to. Why are we doing that? Why are we doing that? There's no interaction with Kiffin. There's no interaction with Nollies. There's no interaction with Keach and what they talked about on these things. Zilch. Just Roger Williams and these other, fringe guys. Wow.
Men like Merton and Williams are the historical core of the idea of soul liberty and cannot be ignored if one wants to reach credible conclusions.
Wow.
Thank you for listening today. This is Ron the Baptist wishing you grace and peace.
Virtue, grace. I cannot go down that road. That is just on a historical level is really, really bad. Yeah. I hope this has been helpful. I'm just kind of sitting here kind of flabbergasted because, again, I had listened to most of this, but I had not heard that part toward the end where if it doesn't have Roger Williams and this other guy, whoa, you can't trust it. Okay. Wow. Anyways, I hope this is helpful. Go read. Check out our blog posts on the Particular Baptist.net where we go through primary source material talking about Particular Baptist political theology. It's helpful. I will link that article in the description on YouTube and on Facebook and on the audio side, so you can go and look up those things for yourself. Hope this is helpful. And yeah, we press on. We press on toward recovery of our tradition, proper recovery of our tradition, the understanding of these things. So, anyways, everyone have a great rest of your weekend, and Lord willing, we will be back next week. Take care. Thank you for joining the Particular Baptist Podcast. Be sure to follow us on Twitter at The Particular B and subscribe to us on YouTube where you can find more of our podcast content. Also check out our blog at theparticularbaptist.net. And if you'd like to support our ministry, become a patron today at patreon.com/The Particular Baptist.